And we're back with Congressman Darrell Issa, Republican of California. Thanks for being here, sir. So you wrote about civil asset forfeiture in...
A catchy name.
Yeah, right. Let's start with what it is.
Well, it can be at times highway robbery. It allows law enforcement, based on their suspicion that something is being used in a crime. No arrest, no probable cause in some cases, just $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 in cash, or maybe somebody's home. And in these egregious examples, because there are no safeguards on the law, federally or in some cases state, what happens is the police can simply say, I'm going to take your cash. And they have done it at various amounts. The most egregious, the Washington Post had, was a Christian band had $53,000 they just collected for an orphanage. And it was taken, and if not for the public outcry, it might have been months or years, or if ever, before they would have gotten it back. But it's a strange look in the law in which we want the assets, let's just say a car filled with drugs, we want it to be able to be seized, and we've allowed for that asset never to be returned if it was part of enabling a crime, any more than we'd want a gun to be put back in a criminal that used it for a stick-up. But the safeguards, the absence of a judge ruling, the presumption of innocence, all the things that we assume you and I have, your money doesn't, or your car doesn't, or your home doesn't. And in the case of the one example where a son was doing something wrong, he had $40 worth of heroin, he was outside his home, but they seized the home without notice, evicted the parents, and you look and say, wait a second here. First of all, parents take a lot of responsibility for their children, and they should. But what was necessary to evict somebody from a home? It was being used, in fact, to punish the parents, to make them throw their child out of the house and not let them back in. And it really is those kinds of examples where you say, police normally do the right thing, but when they do the wrong thing, how do we make sure that there's a safeguard that doesn't cause you to have to spend your life savings to try to get your money back?
Well, explain its legislative history. I mean, how did these laws get on the books in the first place?
Well, they were well-intended laws because can you imagine being a policeman before asset forfeiture, federal and state, and you've got to give, if you will, the getaway car back to the criminal. You've got to give, let's just say that you go into a bookie operation, or you go in and this would be probably the best one. You go in and you find a pound of some drug and $50,000 in cash in the same bag. Well, you know where the two are connected, so you seize both of them. And at the end of the trial, if that cash can be used to make victims whole, or in some other way, of course, you're going to keep it. That was the intention. And the idea was that you would seize the cash, not your money out of your bank account, but cash or other assets. It's been used sometimes simply to strip potential defendants of all of their ability to defend in some cases. And I think the most egregious part of this is with the exception of a few states, California being one that's tried to do reform, they never have to bring a charge against you in order to keep, if you will, your assets they suspect of a crime. And you go, well, wait a second, where is my presumption of innocence, and where is my personal property's presumption of innocence?
If police believe, those are the words.
If police believe. And police have a conflict of interest here, because the police and their law enforcement agencies, this is a big asset for their budget. They're actually getting, if you will, slush funds, monies that are not appropriated that they can spend where they feel they need to. They can spend it. So it's sort of like if every time a cop gave you a ticket, all the money went to their benevolent society. You'd go, well, wait a second here. Is he writing tickets to benefit himself? So we need to do a couple of things, and some states have done this, but we need to do it federally. We need to put safeguards in so that police abuse is quickly stemmed. We need to make sure that the person who feels they've wrongfully had money taken away starts off with a quick remedy to get it back that doesn't cost them a fortune. And we need to take away the incentive for these funds to always end up essentially benefiting the entity taking it.
Well, California has acted. Did that stop it?
Well, it would have stopped it, except the California law enforcement in order to continue doing this, simply switched to the federal law, and California hasn't prohibited them from essentially using this back door. And this is a reason that legislation that we'll be working on a very bipartisan basis will be about closing the back door, reforming it federally, and also if a state chooses to go further, telling the state officials that they can't go further using any federal law, then they could use using state, because we don't want to be circumventing the states.
Why is it that states can circumvent their own laws and fall back on this federal law?
Well, it's basically a joint venture program that allows them under federal law to do a revenue sharing. So they use the federal law and then they get 65% of it back. You know, I don't want to disparage law enforcement because these laws are being used properly most of the time. The problem is most of the time isn't good enough when it's your civil rights. When you're a young musician going across the country on a train and the only crime you have is being the only black man on a train, having bought a one-way ticket for your dreams on the West Coast, and you got $16,000 all in cash, and they take it away, and when you ask, well, how are you going to live? You don't even have a return trip, and that's your problem. Or worse than that, $50,000 that a man in Nevada had won in gambling winnings, taken away from him, and he's told, if you don't say anything or I'll take your car. Well, he did say something, and of course, in this case, it's pretty obvious that police probably didn't intend to even disclose that $50,000. It was just cash they were taking. They ended up in that unusual case, not only returning the $50,000 that was taken at gunpoint from a car, but paying his legal fees because he stood up, and I think they were embarrassed. But each of these shows the need for a reform. You can't have police simply seizing cash and telling you to go on.
So will it make it to the floor? Have you had assurances from the Speaker that you can get this legislation on the floor?
We have a bipartisan group working on criminal justice reform. Jim Sensenbrenner heads a lot of it. And this is part of criminal justice reform. There's no question at all that just like so many other things where you have good programs and then you see challenges or things that end up wrong, every so often you have to say, okay, it's time to fix these. This is a program that needs to be fixed federally, and hopefully the states will follow.
Okay, let's get to calls. John's up first in Great Falls, Montana, independent. Hi, John.
Hello, how you doing, Representative? Hey, greatest respect goes out to you and your colleagues. I have a problem, a personal problem with this whole thing, and it's the color of law that these people are using now to. I just started up a new business, and I had a public official wanting to enter my property because I was moving some dirt around, and they brought a sheriff, and they tried to get onto my property, which I wouldn't allow it because they didn't have a search warrant. But they had no respect for the rule of law, and what they're doing under the color of law right now is appalling. And I'd like you to comment on how the color of law is being changed by these public bureaucrats and trying to enforce these nonsense laws that's going on. It also works with the forfeiture law. If they have the, if the color of law works for them, they're going to take as much money as they can. It's nothing more than robbing under the guise of being a public official. Thank you.
Well, the caller has a very good point. We have a balancing act. We want to support law enforcement. We do. At the same time, the courts and the lawmakers, federal and state, we have an obligation to find these balances. Inspectors going on people's property, yes. We, with rare exceptions like a fire, we want to make sure that they go on with appropriate notice and the like. Civil asset forfeiture is sort of this particular one we're working on, but you see it with the encryption fight in the Department of Justice, where Congress is saying, yes, we want you to succeed, but there have to be limits, and the Constitution and fair balance of history support that. The caller brings up a point that the court has also weighed in on. Law enforcement, bless their hearts, they've tried to do certain things. Well, one of them they tried to do was find basically pot growing in homes by flying over them and looking for hot spots. And the court said that's not probable cause, and no, you can't just fly over looking for it and then go into people's homes. So it's a balance. We want to give law enforcement a lot of power and the courts, but both the courts and Congress have an obligation to balance it. And that's what we're doing here, is trying to bring some balance back, not to eliminate programs that work, but to rein in potential abuses and civil rights violations that seem to have occurred, not always, but often.
Sandy's next in Columbus, Georgia, independent.
Hi.
Morning, Sandy.
Good morning. I see it all the time in Columbus, Georgia.
Hey,
Got
Sandy.
a lot of drug dealers here.
Okay, Sandy, you got to turn down that TV. You're getting confused by the feedback there.
Okay, hold on, just
All right.
a second. I had it turned down, and I didn't.
You know, I
Okay,
spent some
muted.
time in Columbus, Georgia. That's home of Fort Benning and Jump School. So
Yes.
there's a lot of red clay there, but that's not what you want to talk about.
Go ahead, Sandy.
The police have a hard enough job to do as it is, but sometimes they overreach and they go too far. Like the kid that had all that dope in his pocket and cash. They didn't have any right to take the parents home from them because their kid was selling dope. Throw the kid in jail and try him. There's all kinds of cases like that going on right here in this small community that we live in. Fort Benning is 4 times the size of Columbus, Georgia.
Okay. So, Congressman, is it a frequent occurrence all over the country?
It can be, and of course, asset forfeiture can sometimes be used as a bargaining tool to get somebody to plead out or to do something else. And there are some other areas we're not covering in reform, and the caller, in addition to pointing out the size of Fort Benning and the home of armor was also bringing up a point. When you attach homes to civil asset forfeiture, it's particularly important that due process work differently than it has. It's one thing to say that if you're using your home as your base of operation to do criminal activities, civil asset forfeiture will continue to allow for that home to ultimately be taken away as part of your criminal activity. No one's expected to change that, but there have been some problems in that area. The caller pointed out one of the most egregious, where the parents of a child, and $40 worth of heroin does not make a big criminal enterprise, seizing the house and evicting the parents was certainly egregious. If the child is ultimately convicted, if in fact it's shown that the parents had some complicity in it, then one could make a stretch as to the asset. But what we've seen in some cases is apartments are being rented to somebody, and the entire apartment or apartment complex is seized, and without the due process of, look, was the owner benefiting from it, involved in it? We have to make a connection in civil asset forfeiture between a crime and the owner, or reasonable care. Now, having said that, everyone that rents out jets knows that if they get caught carrying drugs, they've just lost a jet. So there is a certain amount of, if you're in business to rent things, you do some reasonable process. But could you imagine if police were able to seize every Hertz rent-a-car simply because somebody rented it and then had drugs in it? We've got to set lines. The caller brings up the point that the police have a hard job. We want to make sure they can continue to do their job. We want this tool to work when appropriate. But more than anything else, we want to make sure that a judge, a person who is not going to benefit from it, who's defined as a neutral, is early involved in the question of, was that policeman's reasonable belief reasonable?
Virginia Beach. John, a Democrat, you're on the air with the congressman.
Good morning, Congressman Issa.
Good morning, John.
Saying if you and I agree on something, there's a great potential for bipartisan resolution on this issue. I'm an attorney, and as an attorney, I've found it difficult to obtain or regain the property that's been taken from my clients. And part of the reason is it's so expensive. If the government contests the seizure of, say, $10,000, if they contest that it costs $10,000 to recover the property in legal fees. There's no provision for a public defender to take this on behalf of a client or any type of court-appointed representative. So, for instance, the example of the African-American man getting $16,000 taken away from him, the problem is he has no remedy because he can't get an attorney. or an attorney won't be economically viable for this. Another matter I've experienced is where I've represented in federal court a defendant who's had $60,000 cash seized from him, and because of that, the said that he had $60,000 of assets which he did not have access to. He didn't qualify for a public defender. So I go up before the judge asking, since he can't qualify for a public defender and he has these assets, can he take some of these assets to pay my legal fee? And the judge says no, and there went my potential big B case.
Well, I'm sorry to have to smile a little bit at the paradox that you find yourself in, because this is one of the complications. Money needs to have the same rights as humans when, in fact, it's human beings' money. And that's where this isn't. There's not a presumption of innocence for the money or the home. There's not a presumption that you are entitled to counsel for withholding. And in our case, one of the reforms on a very bipartisan basis, Elijah Cummings and other Democratic members, and I agree on this, what we want to do is, if you don't make the charge, you don't get to keep the asset. And I think that's an important one, is to claim that it's criminal in nature. About the only way I'd let somebody keep that asset is if the guy says, that money, that dope, it ain't mine. Well, you may not have to charge the person, but you ought to be able to keep the money and the dope that somebody says isn't theirs until somebody comes to claim the pair. You've got a very good point, though. It should be reasonably presumed that money belongs to an individual and is not criminal unless there's a fair showing. Now, one of the challenges is you really do have a fair showing when you have an arrest. But so many of the examples we see, there isn't even an arrest. It's simply give up this and we'll let you go, and that's got to stop.